Hey, Indian Creek 8th grade students, it's Professor Blazek, and I'm here with the final entry in our video series on World War I, looking at the world's search for peace. Now, the guiding question that I would like you to keep in mind as you watch this video is, what obstacles stood in the way of peace in Europe? Now, as we have discussed previously, much of Europe had been destroyed during World War I. Millions of people who had suffered through the war were homeless and hungry, and the empires of Russia, Austria Hungary, and Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire, had crumbled by the war's end. Now, there were many peoples throughout Europe who would also struggle to form independent nations from these collapsed empires. Ethnic groups had this same wish to create their own nations from the start of the war, as the nationalist feelings still remained throughout Europe. But the question was which groups would be allowed to break off, and how would these transitions be overseen? Now, American President Woodrow Wilson would aim to take a leading role in this post war period, and he created a peace plan called the 14 Points. And these were 14 ideas he felt would best serve the world during this transitional time. Now, these 14 points included adjusting the boundaries of certain areas of Europe and creating new nations, going back to the issue we just discussed of ethnic groups still wishing to break off from the old empires and create their own countries. Now, the 14 points also included implementing free trade and freedom of the seas and peaceful settlements over colonies. And this would hopefully prevent any drama from competing imperialist countries from occurring. Wilson also wanted to create arms limits and reductions in order to stop large nations from building up massive militaries in actions that could be seen as threatening to other countries. Now, as you can tell, these 14 points clearly were meant to address the many causes of World War I itself, and Wilson, among other world leaders, wished to remedy these past mistakes. Now, Wilson's 14 points also included the creation of a League of Nations that would help preserve peace and prevent future wars. And the League of Nations would help find diplomatic and peaceful settlements of any future drama. And Wilson hoped that getting as many countries involved as possible would lessen any future threats to world peace. Now, Wilson's plan had some early supporters, but the backing of his plan faded when it became clear that the 14 points would interfere with the interests of individual nations. So, once nations realized it wouldn't help them out as much as they were hoping, they really did not favor the 14 points in the League of Nations. So, unfortunately, many countries still put their own wishes far above the worldwide good, and it didn't help that Wilson's plan was also vague in addressing some of the difficult questions that were faced by the world after the war. So many other countries wanted a more concrete plan moving forward. Now, in January of 1919, the leaders from 27 nations would gather in Paris for a peace conference, and the Allied leaders, or the former Allied leaders, would dominate this conference because neither Germany nor Russia had even been invited, which really set the tone for how these peace plans were going to be designed. Now, the leaders from France and Great Britain wanted Germany to make reparations or payments for the damages caused by World War I, especially because so much of the fighting had taken place in French territories. In addition, America, Britain, and France all supported the anti Bolshevik forces who were in Russia because these three countries feared the spread of communism if the Bolsheviks remained in power. Remember, the Bolsheviks were communists. And this was the main reason why Russia had not been invited to the peace conference, because remember that one of the main motivations for America getting involved in the war was that it saw the war as a fight for democracy, and Russia was no longer a democratic government. Now, following the debates at the Paris Peace Conference, the Allies and Germany would sign the Treaty of Versailles on June 28th, 1919. And this treaty stated that Germany had to accept full responsibility for the war and pay billions of dollars of reparations to the Allies, a figure that would be over $400 billion in terms of today's money. This would essentially cripple the German economy and further damage that country. Germany also had to disarm its military forces and surrender its overseas colonies and some land in Europe, again stripping Germany of much of its imperial gains. Finally, the Treaty of Versailles would divide the former empires of Austria-Hungary and Russia into several new nations, but many of the borders that were created by the treaty were disputed by the different ethnic groups, and this would actually lead to future conflicts. So, not all of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles really worked out that well. Now, in looking at these maps, you can see the makeup of Europe both before and after World War I. You can see some of the new countries that were created include Poland, Czechoslovakia, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Yugoslavia. The Central Powers empires, as well as Russia, are noticeably smaller as well. Now, in the wake of the Paris Peace Conference, there were many Americans who disliked the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. Some Americans, along with other Allied citizens and leaders, felt that Germany had been treated too harshly in the Treaty of Versailles. However, there were some who actually felt that Germany had gotten off too easily, so it was really just a matter of perspective at this point. In addition, some Americans disliked the League of Nations because it created the feeling that America would have made a permanent commitment to international issues, which could potentially drag America into future conflicts that they did not otherwise need to be involved in, similar to how some felt when America got involved in World War I in the first place. Now, there were also political motivations to this distrust as well, because many Republicans saw rejecting the Treaty of Versailles as an opportunity to embarrass President Wilson and the Democrats. This is, unfortunately, what we still see in our country today, where political parties plays a major role in decision making and the viewpoints that are taken on issues. And Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge was the most powerful opponent of the treaty and the League of Nations. Lodge was a longtime enemy of President Wilson, and he would do all he could to delay a vote on the treaty. And this would create doubt as to whether or not Congress would approve the peace treaty and America's entry into the League of Nations. So, in reaction to this, in September of 1919, President Wilson began a speaking tour to gain support for the treaty and for the League of Nations. However, President Wilson would collapse on September 25th, and this would quickly end the speaking tour. Wilson would then suffer a stroke when he was back in Washington, D.C., and this would leave the president partially paralyzed. In the wake of these events, opposition to the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations continued to build, and both the treaty and the League of Nations would ultimately be rejected by the U.S. Senate. Now, the U.S. would go on to sign a separate peace treaty with the Central Powers in 1921, and even though President Wilson had created it, the U.S. would never go on to join the League of Nations. So this was a major blow to an important idea that President Wilson had had in the time after World War I. Now, this brings us to the end of our video series on World War I, and we return once more to this section's guiding question. Answers should include both the questions that face the world and the debate that raged in the United States as well. Until our next unit, this has been Professor Blazek signing off.